Yeah, family, y'all. Just keep it tight, keep it tight, keep it tight. Oh, right. Yeah. Here we go.
For Socrates, then, the question is, how do we arrive at these universal definitions? Okay, for anything that exists, let's classify it and have it as part of, what is the universal definition that separates that thing from other things? So that, for instance, for Socrates, the universal definition is that constant and abiding characteristic or characteristics that stand out. What are those things that, even though things change, there's something about human beings that always stays the same? Even though some are babies, and some are adolescents, and some are adults, and some are senior adults, what do they all have in common? Oh, they're all rational animals. Even if they're only babies, or adolescents, or adults, or senior adults, what they all have in common then is what we're looking for in universal definitions. How interesting then that when it came to different things like the various adjectives that we have in our language, there are different words that we use to describe things like good. Oh, such and such is good. Oh, that's a good computer. Oh, I have a good husband or a good wife. Well, I go to a good church. Anytime you use the word good, Socrates was saying, you're referring to some other reality. How do you know what good is? Have you thought about that for a moment? How do you know what good is? You must know that good is something in relation to something else that is good with a capital G. That's what he referred to as the forms and the ideas. That there is this good with a capital G that exists in some metaphysical place, some transcendent reality. This good with a capital G exists somewhere, and because your soul knew that good with a capital G before you were born, right now life is simply taking a look at other things in light of what we knew to be good with a capital G. You're a good husband, or you're a good wife, or you're a good church, or you're a good telephone, or whatever you have that's good. That word that you're using is simply, it's describing that thing in light of the good with a capital G. The other things would be beautiful, for instance. How do you know if something is beautiful? Because everything that's beautiful, we know it is beautiful in light of beauty with a capital B. Another idea or form, that this beauty exists somewhere metaphysically, transcendentally, and everything that's beautiful, we know the beautiful because of how beautiful or not it is compared to beauty with a capital B. And so by speaking of objects as more or less beautiful, we imply that there's a standard, right? Let's not use beautiful, let's use good. That something is better than something else. What do you mean something is better than something else? That means that something is more good and something is less good, right? Well, how can you start judging how good things are? Ooh, he did well on his paper. Oh, she did better on her paper. How can you judge those things? It's all in light of these higher standards, these forms, these ideas of what good really is. There's a difference between the universal concept then, these universal concepts, and the individuals, because the individuals are never going to be perfect. Is there a perfect human being? No. Is there a perfect good thing on this earth? No. So everything that's good is simply good in comparison to the perfect good, the absolute good. In the Christian tradition, we refer to that as God. Right? So how interesting that we know the universal concepts through imperfect objects. It would be like mathematicians. In math, we draw lines and circles. Ooh, that is a good circle. Ooh, that's a good line. But if you look really closely at that circle and at that line, is it a perfect circle? And is it a perfect line? Is it possible to draw a perfect circle or a perfect line? So for them, it's sort of like the same with all of these. What happens is there is no perfect circle, there is no perfect line, but just approximations. And that's the same here on earth. There is no perfect human being or perfect anything else. That's a pretty good circle. How can you judge that it's good in relationship to something that is absolute good? That's a beautiful circle. Oh, thank you. Very kind of you. How do you judge that? We judge that in relationship to absolute beauty. Is it a perfect circle? It's not a perfect circle. It's a good circle. The Sophists, remember them from last week? So the Sophists, known for their sophistry, for their fallacious arguments, right? They were being trained in rhetoric so as to be able to go into court and win cases, regardless of whether or not the person was guilty or innocent. Yikes. So the Sophists had a relativistic ethic, which simply means that something could be right or wrong for you, but that doesn't mean it is for me. Socrates was trying to come up with universal definitions so that it's not this relativism where in one city something is good and in another city something else, and that thing is not good, right? Instead, he wanted to come up with universal concepts like justice, that there has to be this universal concept of justice that would be true for all people and all cities, all states. That there have to be these concepts, these universals that are universal, that are shared by all. Induction then, Socrates' method was very practical and was dialectical, which is a very fancy word for, he worked it all out in conversation, by talking to people. He would talk to people and ask them, well, how do you define justice? And they would define justice. And then he would ask a question or, see how good or not that definition was to keep improving that definition. He got into conversations, professed his own ignorance, and helped people to arrive at universal definitions. The conversation proceeded from the particular to the universal, from the less perfect to the perfect. So in all of this, Socrates was interested in coming up with more perfect definitions, more universal definitions of things like good and beauty and justice. So one example is the example of justice then. In one of his books, he's going to be interested in defining justice in his book, The Republic. And so the question becomes, what is justice? How's he going to figure out what justice is? He's going to sit down with someone and ask them, what do you think justice is? And the first definition they're going to come up for injustice, the first definition they're going to come up with is, injustice is to deceive, injure, or enslave another person. That's unjust. It's unjust to deceive, injure, or enslave another person. But wait a minute, is it unjust to enslave an enemy? Or to injure an enemy? There are people who go off to war and who kill other people. Is that not just? So as a result, then they tweak the definition. So what do they say? Well, then let's say that the unjust action is that which is when those things, deceiving and injuring or enslaving, are done to friends. So do you see what's happening? Socrates is talking with another person, in this case in his book, The Republic, in Plato's book, The Republic, but how it is that they're taking one definition and they're just trying to come up with better and better definitions. So it's only unjust when you do it to your friend, okay? So let's think of an example of when it is that you deceive or injure or enslave a friend. For instance, what if your friend is thinking of committing suicide, and so you take away their sword, and they ask you, hey, have you seen my sword? And you say, no, I haven't seen your sword. You just deceived them. You lied to your friend. So is that an injustice? Your friend wants to commit suicide, you hid the sword and lied to him. Is that injustice? Just how it is that what they're doing is they think they come to an answer, and then Socrates asks a question, and so like, well, they see that their previous answer wasn't adequate, wasn't good enough. Or he asks, is it an injustice if a father deceives his son to take a medicine that will heal him, right? Here you are, you're deceiving someone, a friend, someone you know, intentionally. So is that an injustice? No. So as a result then in the Republic, they come up with the definition that an injustice or actions are unjust only when performed against friends with the intention of harming them. Oh. So in this process, what we see is that a person like Socrates, through this dialectic, through this conversation, he and the person he's talking to, they come to better and better definitions of the things that they're trying to define. So they're trying to come to universal definitions, things to define all general situations. What can we use the word justice of? And they come up with an answer, and then they test that answer. Well, what about this situation? What about the medicine or the sword? Is that unjust? And they keep asking questions until they come to more perfect definitions. Socrates referred to his method as midwifery, or midwifery if you prefer. What does a midwife do? The midwife comes in and helps you to give birth. Socrates saw himself as a midwife, which meant what? His job was simply to help people give birth to their ideas. Oh, how interesting. That Socrates simply saw himself as a midwife. I'm not going to come in and tell you what to think. I'm just going to help you to bring to birth your own ideas. For Socrates, knowledge and virtue are the same thing. They're identical. They're one. So knowledge is virtue and virtue is knowledge. Simply mean if you know what's good, then you'll do the good. Think about that for a moment. If you know that it's good, you'll do it. So the question then becomes, knowing the good, because once we teach our children what is good, then they'll do that, presumably, according to Socrates. No one chooses evil as such. That's going to be a thought that we see Plato come back to here in a moment. But I say we don't choose evil. The example that I always like to use is of the child lying to his or her parents, right? The child breaks the lamp. The parent raises his or her voice and says, "Did you break the lamp?" What's the child going to say? "I didn't break the lamp. The child lied." Why did the child lie? Did the child choose to do evil as such? No, the child actually chose a good, which was avoiding punishment. We don't choose evil as such, said Socrates. What we're doing is we're choosing we're choosing evils that appear to be good at that moment. So if we fail to do right, like the child who lied, why did the child lie? Due to ignorance rather than moral weakness. That child doesn't realize that it's a better thing to tell the truth. Why did that child lie? Socrates said that child lied because of ignorance. That child didn't recognize that it's a better thing to tell the truth. That child is ignorant. That child thought that it was better to lie and avoid punishment than to tell the truth and to take the consequences. We're going to see this bear out in Socrates' life in a moment when we come to how it is that he died. Socrates decided to stand by his principles rather than to try to get out of it, like the child who broke the lamp and lied. Socrates said that an action is right if it promotes true happiness. There are different types of happiness. We'll see that there are different types of happiness in this world. If it leads to true happiness, then it is right. Everyone seeks his or her own good, but not every action promotes true happiness. So the child that lied to his or her parent about the lamp, the broken lamp, was seeking his or her own good. That child was seeking his or her own good, avoiding punishment. But did that action promote true happiness? No. The example that Socrates used was of getting drunk. Ooh, getting drunk seems like such a good thing. Why? Because you're forgetting your sorrows, right? I'm so depressed right now. My girlfriend just walked out on me. I'm going to go get drunk. It seems like a good thing. Why do I drink and get drunk? Because it seems to me to be a good thing at that moment. Interesting. Does that mean that it's promoting that true happiness? Is it really a good thing? No. It seems good in that moment, but what's happening is it's injuring your health. It's enslaving you in habit. Wow, they recognize how it is that there were habit-forming substances back then. And it goes counter to reason, which is what distinguishes us from animals. We are rational animals, and it's not rational to drink to forget your sorrows. How is that for a pointed accusation by Socrates? I mean, it's not rational to drink, he's saying. Remember, he was this abstemious man who didn't drink and didn't eat a lot. I mean, he was saying it goes against reason to do things like that that could enslave you in habit and that could injure your health. It's just contrary to reason. To drink and get drunk goes contrary to reason. And if the person who's drinking realized that, then he or she wouldn't drink.
So that comes back to the ignorance?
Comes back to ignorance. That person doesn't realize what true happiness is. Because being enslaved by habit and injuring your own health, that is not true happiness. If he or she recognized true happiness, he or she wouldn't do it. If you get drunk believing it's good, you're ignorant and you don't recognize what true good is. And if you know that not getting drunk is conducive to true good and happiness, then you won't get drunk. If you know that staying sober is conducive to true happiness, then you're going to stay sober. For Socrates, it had everything to do then with ignorance. Modern psychology, I think that we would, give some credit to things like habits. Once you do something, you get into a certain habit of doing something, whether it's smoking or drinking or using any other substance. I mean, you get into certain habits where the mind has difficulty breaking from that. For Socrates, then, the wise person realizes that it's better to be self-controlled and just and courageous and the embodiment of all these virtues. It's better to be virtuous than not to be virtuous. So for Socrates, knowledge can be taught. Virtue cannot be taught, but if you know what's right, then you'll do what's right. So knowledge can be taught, and once you're taught knowledge, then you'll do what's right. If we were to teach our kids the effects of drugs, or the effects of sex, or the effects of any other thing that leads to certain consequences, if they knew the consequences, according to Socrates, they would choose that. They would choose that virtue. Intellectualism, is it favorable to democracy? Challenge is, Socrates had this challenge. He was a smart guy. He realized that people in positions of power were not always so smart and so interested in the intellectual life. Which meant what? Should we have a democracy? Is Socrates going to favor a democracy where we each get to vote on who leads us? That is sheer idiocy. Why? Why would you let the multitude decide who their leader should be? It seems that we should have true rulers who know how to rule. Rather than just looking around the room and having an election right now, okay, well, let's elect a leader for this class. No. There should be other ways of coming to how it is that we see who the best ruler is in any given society. The analogy they use is you wouldn't have a ship captain who knows nothing of the route or of the captain's art. Can you imagine how dangerous that would be? We're all on a ship and we just decide, okay, who's going to be the captain? Wouldn't you want to know? Okay, the captain should at least have some idea of where we're going and how to get there and what that means for how the sails need to be and all. And the captain needs to have a certain knowledge. Socrates' trial and death. So we said that intellectualism isn't always favorable to democracy. There's certain times when virtuous people are killed. When bad things happen to good people. Happened to Jesus. Now we're going to see how it happened to Socrates 400 years earlier. The year was 406 before Christ, 406 BC. Socrates refused to agree that 8 commanders be tried together. So his friends were saying, let's just try all 8 together. Why are we going to waste our time having 8 different trials? They're all guilty of the same thing. Let's have one trial for all 8 and get it done with. Did Socrates say good idea? Socrates was showing himself, even though he was associating with all these people, there was this tension that was starting to rise because, the rest of them had lives and wanted to get this trial over with. Let's just try all 8 together. If they're guilty, we give them the death penalty. If they're innocent, whatever it is, let's just get it over with. Socrates was not in favor of that. 2 years later, he refused to take part in the arrest of Leon of Salamis. The oligarchs, the ruling party, intended to murder Leon so that they could take his property. Is Socrates going to agree with the murder of a man simply so he can get his property? You're going to have a problem with this. And so it's conflicts like this that are going to put him in, there's going to create a tension between him and his friends. 4 years later, in the year 400 BC, Socrates was brought to trial and found guilty on 2 charges. One, he was guilty of not worshiping the gods, but of introducing new and unfamiliar religious practices. He's guilty of not worshiping our gods. Number 2, he's guilty of corrupting young people. That's a tough one. The first charge is never explicitly defined by anyone, what it meant that he was guilty of not worshiping the gods, but introducing unfamiliar religious practices, because in any of his writings we don't know what those could have been. But the other one, of corrupting the youth, what was he trying to do? Was he teaching young people to be bad? How fascinating that the charge that he was found guilty of was of corrupting young people, when really all he was about was the care of people's souls and about tending to these virtues in life. And if you know what's good, let's talk about and figure out what's good, because if you know what's good, young people, you'll do it. What was he guilty of? Corrupting you. As a result, he received the death penalty. Back then, when you received the death penalty, though, it wasn't over, because just because they proposed the death penalty, you have the opportunity to propose another penalty. Okay, they're proposing the death penalty, so maybe you want to propose another penalty for yourself, like, instead of the death penalty, I will exile myself voluntarily for the rest of my life. I will leave Athens and never come back. How does that sound? And then the jury could listen to that and say, okay, that's acceptable. So Socrates' friends are going to suggest that he propose an alternative penalty, like voluntary exile, right? If you leave Athens, then you'll be able to leave with your life. Instead, he came back and he decided to propose an alternate penalty, an alternative. That is, that he proposed a fine of 1 coin, 1 minae, and the reward of free meals in the Prytaneum. I mean, how do you deal with smart Alex? You know what I mean? So here's a guy, you've given him the death sentence, and he comes back and says, well, instead, what if I were to pay you a coin and you were to give me free meals for the rest of my life? You're the jury. Would you respond very well to that? The execution was delayed for a month. Socrates' friends tried to help him escape. Was he going to escape, though? No, because it was contrary to his principles. If they arrested me, then I'm arrested. I'm going to stay here. I'm not fleeing to another place simply to save my life. It's against my principles. He died by drinking hemlock. We've heard of that before, that he drank hemlock. What is hemlock? Is that a tree of some sort? Actually, it's part of the carrot family. Conium. Hemlock comes from conium. Conium is a member of the carrot family. Yikes. And as he was dying, choking on the hemlock, thank you, Deacon Roy, for stepping in with the dramatic. As he was dying and choking on the hemlock, his last words were, Crito, we owe a rooster to Asclepius. Pay it, therefore, and do not neglect it. Virtuous to the end. For those of us who are Christian, of course, whose death do we see in the death of Socrates? Very much we see it as foreshadowing another just man's death. A man who, even though he was unjustly condemned, went with it. Didn't try to run away or escape or go into voluntary exile. He faced it.